The shriek of tearing engines and the thunderous crack split the night before my brain could catch up. I jerked upright, coffee forgotten, as Clara stirred against my shoulder with a sleepy whimper. Through the ferry's salt-streaked windows, I watched a private jet, silver skin gleaming like a knife, plunge through the starless sky. It carved a dying arc over Blackthorn Bay, trailing black smoke and embers, and hit the water with a violence that made the deck shudder beneath my feet. The impact sent a column of white spray erupting into the darkness. Steam hissed where fire met the ocean. For one frozen heartbeat, I sat motionless. My arm locked protectively around Clara's small frame, staring at the wreckage as it bobbed and began its slow, terrible descent into the black water. Then, adrenaline burned the paralysis away. I shoved through the press of screaming tourists, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears, and nearly tripped over a dropped suitcase as I sprinted toward the stern. The ferry's chain-link rail bit into my palms as I vaulted it, my daughter's frightened voice calling my name behind me. Mom? Mom! But I couldn't stop. Someone was in that wreck. Someone was drowning while people filmed with their phones and shouted useless questions at the crew. Oh God. Oh God. Move. I hit the access stairs at a stumble, my sneakers slipping on wet metal, and barely registered the deckhand's shout of protest before I shoved past him to the lower platform. The night wind cut through my thin jacket, sharp and cold enough to sting. My hands shook as I dragged my phone from my pocket and punched 911, gasping coordinates and landmarks to the dispatcher. Private jet down in Blackthorn Bay, north of the ferry terminal. It's sinking now. Before I hurled the phone onto a bench and kicked off my shoes. There was no time to wait for rescue boats. Every second the fuselage sank was a second closer to the stranger inside running out of air. I stripped off my jacket, my keys clattering to the deck, and jumped. The water was a fist of ice closing around my ribs. The shock stole my breath, sent my heart into a wild, panicked rhythm. But I forced my arms and legs to move. Salt spray lashed my face. The ocean swelled and heaved beneath me, dragging me sideways before I found my rhythm and kicked toward the wreckage. Out in the darkness, the jet's broken wing jutted from the surface like a jagged tombstone. The rest was already half submerged, disappearing into the churning black void. "Hello!" I shouted between ragged breaths, spitting seawater. "Can you hear me? Hello?" My voice fell flat against the slap of waves and the low, groaning rumble of metal buckling under pressure. A slick of fuel sheened the surface, rainbowing faintly in the ferry's distant floodlights, and the acrid stench of burning chemicals filled my nose. Coughing, I swam closer, weaving around torn leather seats and spiraling papers that drifted past like pale, ghostly leaves. The fuselage was tilting, sinking faster now, the cockpit windows already half swallowed by the bay. Think, Evelyn, think, sucking a breath deep enough to burn. I dove. The underwater world was murky and green, lit only by the ferry's faraway glow filtering through the surface. My eyes stung with salt as I kicked downward, forcing myself through the pressure and cold. The jet's fuselage yawned open ahead, a torn, ragged mouth of crumpled metal and shattered glass. Inside, strapped into a seat amidst the floating debris, sat a man. He was impossibly still, impossibly composed, his head tilted back against the headrest, white hair drifting like seagrass, his face pale as carved marble. A red brocade coat clung to his frame, soaked and heavy, and blood bloomed silently in the water around him, dark ribbons that coiled and dispersed with each sluggish current. His eyes were closed. Bubbles leaked from his parted lips in slow, sporadic bursts. Not dead. Please, not dead. I grabbed the jagged edge of the torn window and hauled myself inside, scraping my shoulder against broken glass. The cabin groaned around me, metal shrieking as more water rushed in and the angle tilted sharply. My lungs began to burn. I hooked one arm under the man's shoulders and yanked, but he didn't budge. His seatbelt was still latched, the buckle wedge beneath the crushed console. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind as the pressure built in my chest. As the darkness closed tighter, my fingers fumbled for the release, slick and numb with cold, and pressed. The harness gave way. His full weight slumped into me, nearly dragging us both down as the floor groaned and buckled. I locked my arm around his chest, kicked hard against the seat, and fought my way back through the cockpit opening. Broken glass raked my legs. The roar of blood in my ears drowned out everything else. The jet shuddered, sinking faster, the water swallowing us whole. Move, move, move. We broke the surface in an explosion of spray and sound. I gasped, sucking oxygen in great, sobbing gulps, my vision sparking with stars. The man's head lolled against my shoulder, his body limp and terrifyingly still. But then I felt it. The faint, wet rasp of breath against my neck. A cough. Shallow, rattling, but there. Relief and adrenaline surged through me in equal measure. I shifted my grip, hooking my arm more firmly around his chest, and started the brutal swim back toward the ferry. Waves battered us, shoving us sideways, pulling us under. My muscles screamed. My teeth chattered so violently I bit my tongue, tasting copper. The cold was everywhere, inside my bones, slowing my thoughts to sludge. But I kicked. I pulled. I kept his head above water, even when mine dipped below. By the time my feet found the rocky shallows beneath the ferry platform, I couldn't feel my legs. Searchlights swept over us, blinding and bright, and voices shouted directions I barely heard. Hands reached down. Deck hands, maybe paramedics. But before they could pull the man from my arms, his eyes opened. Crimson. Bright, burning crimson, like rubies catching firelight. Not the glazed, distant stare of shock, but something sharp and aware. His lips moved, shaping soundless words against the chaos, and his fingers closed around my wrist with surprising strength. "No hospital," he whispered, his voice low and rasping, textured with an accent I couldn't place. Old, elegant, foreign. "They will come for me instead of the dead." His gaze locked onto mine, urgent and unyielding. "And then for you," I should have argued. Should have shoved him toward the waiting EMTs and let someone else take the impossible weight of him. But beyond the searchlights, pressed against a ferry window with her palms flat to the glass, I saw Clara, her face streaked with tears, her mouth forming my name over and over. I made a choice. He slipped away. I lied to the paramedics as they wrapped a shock blanket around my shoulders. Lost him in the current. I couldn't. My voice cracked convincingly. They didn't question it. They were too busy scanning the dark water for a body that would never surface. Under the cover of the blanket, under the noise and the chaos and the flashing lights, I smuggled the stranger up the platform stairs. His weight pressed against my side, his arm draped over my shoulders like a drunk friend. No one looked twice. By the time the ferry docked, I'd wrapped him in my jacket and a borrowed wool blanket. By the time Clara ran into my arms, sobbing and shaking, I'd made a second choice. To bring him home. That was how the Vampire King came to sleep on my thrift store sofa, seawater pooling beneath his ruined brocade coat, salt crusted white in his hair. I didn't know what he was, not yet. I didn't know about the court, or the carriages, or the war that was already racing toward my tiny row house on Blackthorn Street. All I knew, as I stood shivering in my ransacked kitchen, while Clara clung to my leg, and the stranger's crimson eyes tracked me from the shadows, was this. I had pulled something ancient and dangerous from the drowning dark, and it was watching me like I'd just rewritten the ending of a story. Older than cities, morning, came too bright and too ordinary for what my living room had become. I stood in the doorway, with a mug of instant coffee cooling in my hands, watching the stranger sleep on my sagging thrift store sofa. In the pale daylight filtering through my threadbare curtains, he looked less like something I'd dragged from a nightmare, and more like a problem I couldn't afford. His red brocade coat lay draped over the armchair, still damp and crusted with salt, the fabric so fine it caught the light like crushed rubies. Beneath the borrowed hoodie, Clara's oversized one with the faded unicorn print, his chest rose and fell in a rhythm too slow to be quite human. Clara peered around my hip, her cereal bowl clutched to her chest like a shield. "Is he dead?" she whispered. "No, baby. Just sleeping. He doesn't look like he's sleeping. He looks like a statue." She tilted her head, studying him with the clinical curiosity of an 8-year-old who'd once dissected the neighbor's Halloween decorations to see how the fake blood worked. "Why is his hair so white? Is he really old?" "Older than you can imagine," I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I nudged her gently back toward the kitchen. "Eat your breakfast. Let him rest." But she lingered, fascinated and wary in equal measure, and I couldn't blame her. I'd spent half the night sitting in the hallway with a kitchen knife across my lap, watching him breathe, or rather, not breathe for long. Unsettling stretches before his chest would rise again, slow and deliberate, like breathing was a courtesy he sometimes remembered to perform. At 7:30, his eyes opened, not slowly, not with the groggy confusion of someone waking from trauma. One moment he was still. The next, those crimson irises were fixed on me with a clarity that made my pulse jump. He sat up with the fluid grace of someone who'd never experienced a sore muscle in his life, the hoodie riding up to reveal a torso marked with bruises that had already begun to fade from black to green. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice quiet and textured with that strange old-world cadence. "And the deception. I am in your debt." I set my coffee down before I could drop it. "You're in my living room. I think we're past apologies." His mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Then allow me to offer gratitude instead." He stood, and I realized he was taller than I'd thought, lean and angular in a way that suggested strength without bulk. He moved to the window, paused, then carefully drew the curtain shut. "Might I ask for darkness? And if it's not too much trouble, salt water, to cleanse the wounds, Salt water, I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. For wounds. It draws out impurities. An old remedy. His gaze swept the room. The water-stained ceiling, the duct-taped recliner, Clara's backpack spilling homework onto the floor, and something unreadable crossed his face. Your home is humble, beautiful in its honesty. It's falling apart, I corrected. But it's ours, yes, he said softly. That much is evident. I filled a mixing bowl with warm water and table salt while Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. And when I returned, he'd rolled up the hoodie sleeves to reveal forearms marked with cuts that looked less like crash wounds and more like something sharp and deliberate. He dipped his hands into the water without flinching, his expression contemplative. You should tell me your name, I said, since you're bleeding in my Tupperware. Lucian. He paused, considering. Lucien Voss, sovereign of the Crimson Court, though that title means little on your sofa. His eyes met mine. The jet was sabotaged. By those who believe my reforms are inconvenient. Reforms, I echoed. What kind of reforms require a plane crash? The kind that forbids slaughter, that ration hunger, that sign treaties with governments who prefer not to acknowledge we exist. He lifted his hands from the water, watching salt crystals glitter on his pale skin. I ruled to keep peace. Some would prefer the old ways, unchecked feeding, the harvests, the fear. They sent a message last night. I survived it only because of you. My throat felt tight. You're talking about vampires. I am talking about myself. No hesitation, no drama. Just fact. And about the court that will come looking for me. Soon. I should have laughed. Should have called someone, a hospital, the police, a priest. Instead, I crossed to the hall closet and retrieved the dented first aid cooler I'd quietly carried off the ferry last night. Inside, nestled in ice, were 3 bags of donated blood I'd lifted while the paramedics weren't looking. I didn't know why I'd taken them. Some instinct I couldn't name. I set one on the coffee table. Lucian stared at it for a long moment, something like pain crossing his features. You are remarkably perceptive. I'm a mother. We notice things. I gestured at the bag. You need it. Take it. He did, but not before producing a small pocket knife from his coat and puncturing the corner. He drank like someone taking medicine, necessary, joyless, and when he finished, color had returned to his lips. But his hands trembled. It's not enough, he admitted. The wounds are deeper than they appear. There's daylight trapped in them, iron, holy water, perhaps. The sabotage was thorough. His gaze found mine, hesitant. I would never ask, but a few drops. From your wrist. Only enough to stabilize the fever. I should have refused. Should have run. But Clara was watching from the hallway. And if this creature, this king, wanted to hurt us, he'd had all night to do it. Instead, he'd asked permission. I rolled up my sleeve. The cut he made with the tip of his knife was surgical, precise, barely more than a pinprick. He pressed his mouth to my wrist, and I felt the pull, gentle, careful, before he jerked back as if I'd burned him. His eyes were wide, pupils blown. Sangreal, he whispered, the word half reverent, half terrified. Your blood, it doesn't enthrall. It clarifies. He stared at me like I'd just rewritten every law he knew. You should not exist. I'm a nanny from Blackthorn Row, I said, my pulse still racing. I exist just fine. Not to them you don't. He stood abruptly, moving to the window, his shoulders tense. They'll smell this. What you are, and they'll come. Who? The court. He tilted his head, listening to something I couldn't hear. Then quieter, hoofbeats. Iron-shod and old, still miles away, but coming. I heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and Clara's breathing. But I believed him. How long? I asked. Lucian Voss, Vampire King, turned from my window and met my eyes. Until nightfall, he said. Perhaps less. Twilight came like a held breath. I stood at the living room window with Clara pressed against my side, watching the light bleed from the sky over Blackthorn Row. The street had gone quiet in a way that felt wrong. No evening joggers, no kids on bikes, no Mrs. Chen's terrier yapping at shadows. Even the birds had stopped singing. The silence pressed against my ears like water pressure, deep and suffocating. Mom, Clara whispered. The dogs aren't barking. She was right. Every dog on the block had gone silent at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. Then I heard it, the rhythmic clop of hooves on asphalt, iron-shod and impossibly crisp in the stillness. The sound rolled toward us like distant thunder, growing louder, closer, accompanied by the creak of old wood and the jingle of harness bells. I reached for Clara instinctively, pulling her back from the window just as the first carriage rounded the corner. It was black as a starless sky, lacquered to a mirror shine, pulled by 2 horses that steamed in the cooling air despite the mild autumn evening. Lanterns hung from each corner. Not electric, not flame, but something that burned cold and green. casting shadows that moved against the light. A driver in scarlet gloves sat motionless on the bench, face hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat. Then came the second carriage, the third, the fourth. By the time the fifth rolled to a stop outside my house, Blackthorn Row looked like a movie set. Victorian funeral procession dropped into suburban normalcy. Recycling bins squatted beside carriage wheels. Porch lights flickered on across the street as curtains twitched and neighbors pressed faces to windows. Phones already out and recording. Behind me, Lucian stood perfectly still in the hallway shadows, his expression carved from marble. "They're here," he said quietly. The first carriage door opened. A woman stepped out, and the word that came to mind was Frost. She moved with the liquid grace of someone who'd never stumbled, never rushed, never doubted the ground would hold her. Her gown was the color of winter moonlight, high-collared and severe, and her hair fell in a pale sheet down her back. When she turned toward my house, her face was beautiful the way a knife edge is beautiful, sharp, cold, flawless. "Countess Mirelle," Lucian murmured. "Allie, probably. Court politics are fluid." The second carriage disgorged a man who looked like he'd been carved from different stone, darker, heavier, with eyes that caught the green lantern light and threw it back like a wolf's. He wore modern clothes, black suit, no tie, but somehow made them look archaic. When he smiled at Mirelle, it didn't reach past his teeth. "Lord Severin," Lucian said, and his voice went flat. "Not an ally." More figures emerged from the remaining carriages, men and women in a bizarre mix of period costume and contemporary fashion, some in armor that looked ceremonial until you saw how it moved with them, fluid as silk, footmen in gloves, coachmen who stood too still. And through it all, the neighbors watched and whispered and filmed, turning my street into a theater. Mirelle walked to my front gate, past my recycling bins, past the cracked sidewalk, past Clara's chalk drawing still fading on the driveway, and stopped. She didn't knock, didn't call out. She simply stood there, impossibly elegant, and waited. Lucien moved to the door before I could stop him. "Don't," I started, but he was already opening it, stepping onto the porch in his borrowed hoodie and salt-stained boots, looking like every king who'd ever been pulled from a throne and forced to remember he was mortal. The Countess inclined her head, barely, precisely. "Your Majesty," Severin didn't bow. He descended from his carriage slowly, deliberately, his gaze sweeping over Lucian, then the house, then me standing in the doorway. "Lucian," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "You look diminished." "I look alive," Lucian corrected. "Which seems to disappoint you." "On the contrary," Severin spread his hands. "We've come to ensure your continued survival. The court is concerned." "The court," Mirelle said coolly, "is divided." And just like that, the front yard became a battlefield. Other nobles moved forward. Some knelt on my patchy grass, heads bowed toward Lucian. Others flanked Severin, hands resting on sword hilts that shouldn't exist in modern suburbia, but somehow did. The street hummed with tension. Across the way, Mr. Patel stood on his porch with his phone out, narrating to someone. Mrs. Chen's curtains snapped shut. Protocol crashed into reality like ice water. Ancient creatures of legend arguing jurisdiction next to my daughter's soccer ball and the potted geranium I kept forgetting to water. "We reclaim our king," Severin announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Alive and returned to the court for his protection, or adjudicated for his crimes. Either way, this interlude ends now." I felt Clara move behind me, slipping past my hip to peer around the doorframe. "Mom," she whispered, "that man's hand." I followed her gaze to one of Severin's footmen standing beside the third carriage, a young man in formal livery, gloved hands clasped behind his back. At first I saw nothing wrong, then he shifted, and his wrist bent backward, folding inward with a wet click that made my stomach turn. Not broken, hinged. And when the glove slipped, I caught the glint of steel where bone should be. "Lucian," I started. He was already moving. The footman's arm snapped forward, blade extending from his sleeve in a silver blur aimed directly at my throat. I didn't have time to scream, but Lucian crossed the space between us faster than thought, faster than possible, and caught the footman's wrist mid-strike. The blade stopped an inch from my neck, trembling. "Assassination," Lucian said quietly, his voice colder than I'd heard it. "Is not protocol, Severin." Severin's expression didn't change. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The boy must have panicked. You know how young ones can be. Impulsive." Mirelle's hand went to her hip, and suddenly she was holding a blade thin as moonlight, its edge catching green fire from the lanterns. "Twice in 2 nights, Severin. Your subtlety is slipping." "Careful, Countess," Severin murmured. "Accusations without proof are dangerous. So are conspirators," she replied. The street held its breath. Footman tensed. Noble shifted. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed, then abruptly cut off. Someone had made a call, and someone else had made it disappear. I stepped forward, past Lucian, past the attempted murder, and looked Severin in the eye. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He stays. Severin's smile was a predator's. You have no authority here, mortal. This is my house, I said. My street, my city, and you're standing on my property without an invitation. So I'll say it again. He stays. For a moment, no one moved. Then Morel laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. The mortal has you on a technicality, Severin. Threshold law is threshold law, even in the modern age. Then we wait, Severin said, his eyes never leaving mine. Lucian will have to leave eventually. And when he does, no. Morel moved to her carriage, and with a sharp word to her driver, positioned it sideways across the street, blocking both lanes. The horses stamped and snorted but held. I invoke sanctuary by the right of neutral ground. This street is now contested territory. No violence, no seizure, no judgment until the matter is properly heard. You can't, Severin started. I just did. She turned to Lucian, her expression unreadable. You have until dawn, Your Majesty. Use the time wisely. The other carriages shifted, some moving to flank Morel's position, others circling like wolves. The street had become a throne room, and my neighbors were watching it all through their phones, broadcasting the impossible to a world that wouldn't believe it until it was too late. Lucian stepped back onto my porch, pulling me gently inside. Welcome, he said quietly, to the Crimson Court. The lights died at 8:17. Not a flicker, not a brownout, just instant, total darkness, as if someone had reached up and pinched out every streetlight between fingers. The hum of the refrigerator cut off mid-cycle. My neighbor's porch light vanished. Even the glow from phone screens across the street dimmed and died, batteries draining in seconds like something was drinking the electricity straight from the air. Clara's hand found mine in the blackness, small and cold. Mom? I'm here, baby. I fumbled for the emergency candles I kept in the kitchen drawer, my other hand gripping the counter for balance. Outside, the green lanterns on the carriages burned brighter, cold fire that cast writhing shadows across my living room walls. In that sickly light, Lucian stood motionless by the window, his face carved in sharp relief. Severin's work, he said quietly. He's cutting you off. No power, no calls for help, no witnesses beyond what they've already recorded. Can he do that? The court can do many things when consensus fails. He turned to me, and in the green glow his eyes looked darker, older. I should leave. This was always going to end with me answering them. There's no reason to drag you deeper. Stop. I lit the first candle with shaking hands. Just stop. A knock at the door. 3 precise raps that sounded more like a judge's gavel than knuckles on wood. I opened it to find Countess Morel standing on my porch, alone, her pale gown luminous in the dark. Up close, she was even more unsettling, beautiful in a way that made you forget to breathe, ageless in a way that made you want to look away. May I enter? She asked, her voice formal. I glanced at Lucian. He nodded. Yes, I said, and she crossed the threshold with the careful precision of someone navigating invisible rules. She surveyed my living room, the guttering candle. Clara pressed against my leg, Lucienne half-shadowed by the window, and something almost like approval crossed her face. You're still standing. Good. She produced a small cloth pouch from her sleeve and handed it to me. Salt. Sea salt specifically. You'll need to line every threshold. Doors, windows, any opening large enough for intent to cross. Intent? I echoed. They cannot enter without invitation, not while he's wounded and claiming sanctuary here. But there are workarounds, compulsions, whispers. Salt grounds the threshold, making the boundary real. She glanced at Lucian. He didn't tell you? I was about to, Lucienne said mildly. Of course you were. Morel knelt beside my coffee table, elegant even on worn carpet, and began pouring a thin line of salt across the doorway. Like this, unbroken, and while you work, you must mean it. Intention matters as much as the material. You are saying, this is mine, and you are not welcome. I took the pouch, still warm from her hand. Why are you helping us? Because Lucien's reforms are the only thing standing between your world and a harvest that would make your history books look quaint. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her gown. Severin wants the old ways. Unchecked feeding, terror as currency, humans as livestock. I would prefer not to see that happen. Call it enlightened self-interest. Or call it politics, Lucian added quietly. Those are often the same thing, Your Majesty. Morel moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Severin is calling reinforcements. You have perhaps 2 hours before they arrive in force. If you survive until dawn, threshold law forces a formal hearing. If you don't, she didn't finish. I started laying salt along the windowsills while Clara followed behind me, her small hand steadying mine when they shook. At the back door, I paused. Lucian, this threshold thing, does it work both ways? He met my eyes. Well, I'm wounded, yes. I cannot cross a threshold uninvited. Cannot pursue if you fled. I am, he searched for the word, constrained by courtesy. So if I told you to leave, I would have no choice. He said it simply, without accusation. The rules are older than crowns. I sealed the back door with salt and turned to face him. Then this is ours. This house. This choice. I looked at Clara, who nodded with the fierce certainty of childhood. You stay. A shout from outside. Severin's voice amplified somehow, rolling across the street like thunder. Evelyn Hart, you harbor a fugitive king and refuse the court's lawful custody. This makes you complicit. Accomplice. The king's whore of mercy who thinks mortal compassion trumps immortal law. The words hit like a slap. I felt Clara flinch against me, felt heat rise in my cheeks, shame and fury tangled together. But then Lucian was beside me, his hand light on my shoulder. He's trying to provoke you into rescinding the invitation. Don't. I'm not a whore, I said, voice tight. I'm a mother who pulled a drowning man from the ocean. That's all. That's everything, Morel corrected from the window. To them, mercy is weakness. To us, she glanced at Lucian, it's apparently revolutionary. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the block, 8 inches of dull steel I used for cutting chicken, and weighed it in my hand. Pathetic against swords and supernatural speed, but it was mine. If Severin brings reinforcements, can we hold them? Until dawn? Lucian considered. Perhaps. The salt will slow them. The threshold will bind them. And Morel has called her own loyalists. They'll arrive by midnight to reinforce the sanctuary. Then we hold. I set the knife on the counter within easy reach and finished the salt. Line along the front windows. Clara, you're staying in the upstairs bathroom. Tile floor, 1 small window, tub you can hide in. Take your tablet, your blanket, and the flashlight. Mom, I want to help. You help by staying safe. I kissed her forehead, fierce and fast. That's the job. Can you do it? She nodded, eyes too wide, too serious for 8 years old. Outside, engines rumbled. Cars, not carriages, pulling up behind Severin's formation. Doors slammed. Voices murmured in languages I didn't recognize. Through the window, I counted shapes moving in the darkness. 10, 15, maybe 20. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, I said. No, Lucian agreed. This is a declaration. Morel straightened, her hand going to her blade, then let them declare. When they test the threshold and fail, when the salt holds and the dawn comes, Severin will have shown his hand. The court will have to choose, law or appetite. And if they choose appetite, she smiled, sharp and cold, then we'll know exactly who we're fighting. At 9:30, the soldiers withdrew, not retreating, just pulling back to a perimeter 2 houses down, waiting, watching. The carriages repositioned, forming a loose siege line that blocked both ends of the street. And over the bay, clouds gathered like bruises, heavy and dark, pregnant with a storm that tasted like salt and copper. Lucian stood at my window, looking out at his own court arrayed against him, and said quietly, I'm sorry. You saved my life, and I brought you war. I joined him, kitchen knife still in my hand, and watched lightning fork silent across the distant water. You brought me a choice, I corrected, and I made it. Why? I thought of Clara upstairs clutching her blanket, of Mrs. Chen across the street filming from her darkened window, of the jet sinking into black water and the stranger who'd asked to be left to drown rather than risk me, because someone has to, I said. Outside, the storm rolled closer, and the court settled in to wait. The storm broke at midnight with 3 more carriages. They rolled through the rain like black ships cutting through fog, wheels hissing on wet asphalt, lanterns reflecting in puddles that looked like pools of green fire. I watched from my darkened living room as they took position, forming a complete circle around my house. 12 carriages now, maybe 40 soldiers. The neighbors had finally retreated inside, curtains drawn, phones silenced. Even the boldest witnesses knew when to hide. Severin stepped from the lead carriage, rain sliding off him like oil off water, not a drop touching his perfect suit. He carried something wrapped in black cloth, and when he unfurled it, silver wire glinted in the lantern light, thin as spider silk, barbed like thorns. Lucian Voss, his voice rang out, amplified by something other than lungs. By order of the Crimson Court's emergency conclave, you are summoned to answer for treaty violations, unauthorized reforms, and conspiracy against the old covenants. You will submit to binding and custody, or you will be taken by force. Beside me, Lucian went very still. Silver wire, he said quietly. He's not taking chances. What does it do? Burns, binds, Keeps us weak enough to be judged or executed without resistance. His jaw tightened. It's a death sentence wearing the mask of procedure. Morel emerged from her carriage, flanked by 4 nobles in rain-dark armor. She crossed the salt line into my yard without asking permission. The sanctuary was hers as much as mine now, and faced Severin across 20 feet of soaked grass. "There has been no emergency conclave," she said, her voice carrying despite the rain. "I would have been summoned, as would the eastern houses, the coastal lords, the reformists," Severin interrupted smoothly. "Yes, perhaps that's why you weren't invited. This isn't politics, Countess. This is triage. Lucian's treaties with human governments have made us subservient. We ration hunger while they hunt us with satellites and surveillance. We sign accords that were never ratified by the full court. He has made us prey in our own territory. He has made us civilized," Morel shot back. "There's a difference, is there?" Severin gestured to the circle of carriages, the soldiers, the medieval pageantry playing out on a suburban street. "Look where civilization has brought us, hiding in shadows, begging for permission to exist. The old ways kept us sovereign. The old ways were slaughtered," Lucian interrupted, stepping onto the porch. Rain immediately began soaking through his borrowed hoodie, plastering white hair to his skull. Harvests and terror and humans burning everything they couldn't understand. "The treaties aren't weakness, Severin. They're survival. Your survival, perhaps." Severin smiled, teeth white in the green glow. "But not the courts. Not anymore." He snapped his fingers. 6 soldiers moved forward with the silver wire, unwinding it between them like executioners preparing a garrote. Morel's hand went to her blade, but Severin raised a warning finger. "Sanctuary law prevents violence, Countess. Unless he resists lawful custody. Then all bets and all protections are void." I looked at Lucian. Rain streamed down his face, diluting the old blood still crusted at his hairline. His hands trembled. From weakness or fury, I couldn't tell. "Don't," I said. "Don't let them take you. If I fight, the sanctuary breaks," he said quietly. "And they'll kill everyone in this house to reach me. You, Clara, even Morel for harboring me. Then we all fight," I said, and stepped past him into the rain. The cold hit like a fist, soaking through my shirt in seconds, but I kept walking until I stood between Lucian and the advancing soldiers. My kitchen knife felt absurd in my hand, 8 inches of dull steel against immortal predators, but I held it steady. "He's not going anywhere," I said. Severin laughed. "The mortal speaks. How quaint." His eyes raked over me with something like pity. "This isn't your world. Evelyn Hart, you cannot stop what's coming with household cutlery and misguided compassion. Watch me." One of the soldiers moved faster than I could track, a sudden blur of motion that put him beside me, blade rising toward my throat. I swung the knife instinctively, uselessly. Knowing I was too slow, Lucian caught the soldier's wrist mid-strike. Then, before Severin could give another order, he grabbed the silver wire from the nearest handler and wrapped it around his own hands. The smell hit first, burning flesh, acrid and wrong. Smoke rose from Lucian's palms as the wire seared through skin, but he didn't let go. He pulled. The wire snapped with a sound like a harp string breaking, and he dropped the pieces into the mud, his hands blackened and bleeding. "No binding," he said through clenched teeth. "No custody. No surrender." Chaos erupted. Morel's blade flashed as she parried a strike from Severin's lieutenant. Horses screamed and reared, iron shoes striking sparks on asphalt. Green lanterns guttered and flared as soldiers surged forward, some toward Morel, others toward Lucian. I swung my kitchen knife at anything that moved too close, felt it connect once with something that shrieked and recoiled. Thunder cracked overhead, and for 3 heartbeats the world was nothing but rain and steel, and the terrible grace of immortals at war. Then Morel drove her blade into the ground, and salt exploded outward in a perfect circle, a secondary ward that caught half of Severin's soldiers inside and froze them mid-strike. "Threshold within threshold," she gasped. "Can't hold long." "Long enough," Lucian said, and his voice carried weight now, authority bleeding through despite his burned hands and borrowed clothes. "Stand down, all of you. Stand down," and they did. Not all at once, not willingly, but the weight of his command rolled over the street like gravity, and soldiers faltered. Some knelt. Others backed away, uncertain. Severin alone remained standing, rain streaming down his face. "This changes nothing. At dawn you face the tribunal. You can arrive in custody or in pieces, but you will answer." "Then I'll answer," Lucian said. "But not at your tribunal. At a lawful conclave, with all houses present. If you want me judged, Severin, you'll do it by the full court's law, not your private execution." For a long moment, Severin said nothing. Then his smile returned, sharp and knowing. "Lawful, how noble. Tell me, Lucian, Did the bishops think your reforms were lawful when they blessed that runway? Did the bankers think so when they funded your minister's coup? You're not the victim of rebellion. You're the target of an alliance, human and immortal alike. They want you gone, and they're willing to pay handsomely for it. The words landed like stones in deep water. That's impossible, Morel breathed. The Accords forbid. The Accords, Severin interrupted, are paper and promises. When have those ever stopped anyone? He gestured to his soldiers, who began withdrawing toward the carriages. We'll reconvene at dawn. And Lucian? Bring your mortal champion if you like. She'll make an interesting exhibit. The king's whore of mercy who thinks kitchen knives can save kingdoms. The carriages began pulling away, wheels churning through puddles, leaving deep ruts in the softening asphalt. But they didn't leave the street. They repositioned at the perimeter, blocking exits, settling in. A siege, not a retreat. In the distance, sirens wailed. Police, maybe ambulances responding to the neighbors' calls. But then a helicopter swept overhead, searchlight cutting through the rain, and abruptly veered away as if hitting an invisible wall. The sirens faded. The helicopter's sound grew distant, then disappeared entirely. Someone called in favors, Morel said quietly, watching the empty sky. Someone powerful enough to muzzle emergency services. I looked at Lucian, at his ruined hands, at the rain-washing blood and silver residue into my yard. Who? People who profit from fear, he said, who need the old ways to continue because peace is bad for business. His eyes met mine, tired and ancient and furious. Welcome to the real war, Evelyn. This was never just about me. Thunder rolled across Blackthorn Bay, and my street became the center of something older and darker than I'd imagined. The storm had only just begun. The power didn't come back. By 2 a.m., even the emergency lights on the street had died, leaving only the sickly green glow of carriage lanterns to illuminate Blackthorn Row. I stood in my kitchen with Morel and Lucian, his burned hands wrapped in dish towels soaked in salt water, and listened to the sound I'd been dreading. Boots on boards, heavy, rhythmic, getting closer. Basement, Morel said quietly. Now. Clara was already moving, her backpack slung over one shoulder, flashlight gripped in her small fist like a weapon. I grabbed what I could. Twine from the junk drawer, empty glass bottles from recycling, the baseball bat from the hall closet that hadn't been swung since Clara's one disastrous t-ball season. Lucian descended the stairs last, moving carefully, his ruined hands held away from his body. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house built in 1952. Low ceilings, exposed pipes, concrete walls that wept moisture, and the ancient coal bin that still smelled faintly of dust and old winters. I'd always meant to renovate it. Now I was grateful for every cobweb and cramped corner. They're testing the perimeter, Morel said, crouching by the narrow windows near the ceiling. Through the dirty glass, I could see boots moving past, soldiers circling the house like sharks. They can't enter without breaking the sanctuary, but they'll look for weaknesses, cracks in the salt lines, windows left unsealed. Then we make it harder. I handed Clara the twine and pointed to the stairs. Can you rig a tripwire? Knee height, tight enough to catch but thin enough they won't see it in the dark? She nodded, already moving with the focused intensity she usually reserved for building Lego fortresses. I lined up the glass bottles on the bottom 3. Steps, crude alarm system that would shatter and scream if anyone came down. Morel produced chalk from somewhere in her gown and began drawing symbols on the concrete floor, spirals, and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Confusion sigils, she explained. Won't stop them, but it'll make navigation difficult. Above us, something heavy slammed against the back door. Once, twice. Testing. Lucien leaned against the coal bin, his face gray with pain. Clara approached him cautiously, a flashlight casting wild shadows on the walls. Does it hurt? She asked. Yes, he admitted. Good. She squared her small shoulders. Because if you drink blood tonight, I'm telling Mom, and she'll make you leave. Despite everything, he almost smiled. Then I promise, no drinking tonight. Even if you get really hurt? Even then. She considered this, then nodded, satisfied with the vow. Okay, you can stay. I caught Lucian's eye over her head, saw something raw and grateful there. He'd survived centuries, ruled empires, commanded armies, but an 8-year-old's trust nearly undid him. Another slam above, followed by the sound of splintering wood. They're coming in, Morel said, blade already in hand. Clara, the ducts. I pointed to the old heating vent in the corner, its grate loose from decades of neglect. Can you fit? I think so. Then you're our eyes. Crawl through, tell us where they are, but stay hidden. Understand? She nodded and wriggled into the vent with the ease of childhood, flashlight clutched between her teeth. Within seconds, only the faint scraping of her movement remained. I turned to Lucien. "Your hands will heal, eventually." But the towels were soaked through with blood and fluid, the burns deep enough to show bone in places. "Let me rewrap them." I grabbed the first aid kit from the shelf and knelt beside him, carefully unwinding the ruined cloth. His skin was cold, the burns black at the edges. "This is going to hurt. It already does." But he let me work, his jaw tight as I cleaned the wounds with bottled water and wrapped them in gauze. This close, I could see the age in his eyes. Not years, but centuries, compressed into a gaze that had watched empires rise and fall. "Why reform?" I asked quietly. "Why risk everything for treaties and rations when you could have just ruled?" "Because ruling through terror is exhausting," he said. "And because I was tired of being a monster. Your world was changing. Satellites, surveillance, global communication. We couldn't hide in the old ways anymore. So I thought, perhaps we could evolve instead." His eyes met mine. Apparently that was naive, or brave, or both. From the vent above, Clara's whisper echoed down. 4 soldiers, 2nd floor. 2 more in the kitchen. They're looking for the basement door. Morel extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness broken only by Clara's flashlight beam filtering through the grate. Boots creaked overhead. Voices murmured in languages that predated English. Then, footsteps on the stairs. The first soldier triggered Clara's tripwire and stumbled, cursing. The glass bottles exploded in a crystalline shriek. Morel moved in the darkness. I heard the whisper of her blade, a grunt of pain, then the wet sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Stay back," Lucien said, his voice sharp with command, and I felt rather than saw him move past me, using the shadows like doorways. A soldier appeared in the stairwell, backlit by green lantern glow, and Lucien was simply there, disarming him with surgical precision. No blood, no killing, just the practiced efficiency of someone who'd fought for longer than my country had existed. 2 more soldiers came. We funneled them into the confusion sigils, where they stumbled and swung at phantoms. I used the baseball bat, not to fight but to sweep legs, to block, to buy seconds. It was desperate and ugly and nothing like the movies, but we held. "More coming?" Clara's voice echoed from the ducks. "Maybe 6. They're really mad now." But then, abruptly, the boots retreated. Not defeated, just withdrawing. Up the stairs, through the house, out into the rain. We waited in the darkness, breathing hard, until the last footsteps faded. Morel rekindled the lantern with shaking hands. "They're testing our resolve. Next time they'll come in force." But I was looking at the stairs, where a soldier's dropped weapon lay gleaming. Lucien picked it up carefully, and in the light I saw the engraving on the hilt, a hospital crest, St. Catherine's Medical Center. From outside, Severin's voice drifted down through the broken door. "Resourceful, Evelyn, but pointless. Even if you'd let him go to the hospital like a sensible woman, they would have caged him anyway. Studying him, dissecting him, at least the court kills cleanly." The words hit like ice water. "He's lying," Morel said quickly, "trying to undermine your alliance." But Lucien's expression told me everything. "The surveillance programs," he said quietly. "I mentioned them before. Hospitals are complicit. Anyone with anomalous physiology gets flagged, detained, disappeared into research wings that don't officially exist." I thought about the ferry, the paramedics, how easily I'd lied about him slipping away, how close I'd come to handing him over. "So there was no good choice," I said. "Save him and bring the court. Let him go and feed him to the hospitals." "No," Lucien corrected gently. "There was one good choice, and you made it." Clara dropped from the vent, dusty and proud, and wrapped her arms around my waist. Above us, the soldiers had withdrawn to the perimeter again, but the siege wasn't over. It had just evolved into something more patient, more permanent. We climbed back upstairs as dawn threatened the horizon, and I realized with cold certainty, this was no longer about one vampire king on my sofa. This was about choosing which monsters to trust. Dawn painted the edges of the world gray, but inside my ransacked house, Morel paced like a caged thing, her perfect composure finally cracking. "You need to understand what you're caught in," she said, her voice tight. "This isn't court politics. This is economics." I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Clara did homework, where I balanced checkbooks and circled grocery coupons, and tried to process the word. "Economics, blood banks, pharmaceutical companies, private military contractors." Morel ticked them off on pale fingers. "They all profit from the old system. Organized hunger is lucrative. Blood drives generate millions in donations that get lost to black markets. Research programs study our physiology for military applications. And the fear?" She laughed bitterly. "Fear sells everything from security systems to political campaigns." Lucien stood by the window, watching the siege line hold position as sunrise threatened. The treaties I signed disrupted supply chains. If vampires ration feeding, blood banks lose their shadow revenue. If we stop the harvests, security contractors lose their government contracts hunting us. Peace is expensive for people who profit from war. So they sabotaged your jet, I said slowly. Human institutions and your own nobles working together. A blessed runway, Morel confirmed. Holy water in the fuel lines, sanctified by chaplains on corporate payrolls. Bishops and bankers alike wanted Lucian gone. He was bad for business. Theirs and Severin's. I looked at Lucian, at his bandaged hands, at the exhaustion carved into his ageless face. And if you die? What then? Severin takes the throne. The treaties dissolve. The old ways return. Controlled harvests. Territorial feeding rights. The systematic terrorizing of human populations. His voice was flat, factual. Your world goes back to being prey. My world goes back to being monsters. Everyone profits except the people caught between. Clara appeared in the doorway, still dusty from the ducks, her young face too serious. So we have to keep you alive. No, Lucian said gently. You've done enough. More than enough. I can surrender to Severin's tribunal, hope for mercy. There won't be mercy, Morel interrupted. There will be silver wire and a slow execution, while they broadcast it to every house as a warning. Reform dies with you. I stood, my decision crystallizing like ice in my chest. Then we don't let him die. But if I'm risking my daughter for this, if I'm choosing sides in an immortal war, it has to matter. Not just survival. Change. Real change. Lucian turned from the window, and for the first time since I'd pulled him from the ocean, I saw something like hope in his crimson eyes. What are you proposing? You said there needs to be a lawful conclave. All houses present where? The subterranean chapel, Morel said immediately. Beneath the old transit station on Harrow Street, the one they abandoned in 73. It's ancestral court ground, neutral territory. If Lucien can reach it and call the conclave formally, Severin's tribunal becomes invalid. How far? 5 miles. Through a siege line, past Severin's reinforcements, across a city that's being watched by cameras we don't control. Then we move now, I said. Before full dawn, while they think we're trapped. Morel smiled, sharp, approving. The 5th carriage. It's warded as moving sanctuary. If we can reach it, we gathered what little we had. Clara's backpack stuffed with flashlights and granola bars. My phone, dead but maybe useful. Lucian's ruined brocade coat because he insisted, and the kitchen knife because I wasn't leaving it behind. At the door I paused, looking back at my tiny row house. The sagging sofa, the water-stained ceiling, the life I'd built from grocery coupons and stubborn love. We're coming back, Clara said fiercely, reading my thoughts. Yes, I agreed. We are. Morel's 5th carriage waited 3 houses down, guarded by 2 of her loyalists who looked like they'd stepped from a pre-Raphaelite painting, beautiful and deadly, and utterly out of place next to Mrs. Chen's hydrangeas. The interior was larger than it should have been, upholstered in midnight velvet, lit by green glass lanterns that didn't flicker. We climbed inside, and the door sealed with a sound like a vault closing. Go, Morel commanded, and the carriage lurched into motion. Through the curtained windows, I watched Blackthorn Row slide past, my neighbors' houses, the corner store, the bus stop where I waited every morning, normal life, oblivious to the war playing out in its streets. Then we turned, and Severin's carriages moved to intercept. They're following, Lucian said quietly. Let them. Morel knocked twice on the ceiling, and the driver urged the horses faster. They can't breach moving sanctuary without cause. We just need to stay ahead. But as we raced through pre-dawn streets, I noticed something wrong. Traffic cameras swiveling to track us, their red lights blinking in sequence like a code. Streetlights dying as we passed. And behind us, not just Severin's carriages, but black sedans with tinted windows keeping pace. Someone else is watching, Clara whispered, pressed against my side. Not someone, Lucian said, his voice grim. Something. Surveillance networks, traffic control systems, municipal infrastructure. Someone's weaponizing the city's technology against us. Who has that kind of access? I asked. Morel and Lucian exchanged glances. People with government contracts, Morel said. Security firms. The same corporations that profit from the old ways. The carriage swerved, taking side streets at reckless speed. Behind us, the pursuit grew. More carriages, more sedans, a helicopter's distant thunder. We were being herded, I realized. Pushed toward something. There, Lucian pointed ahead. Harrow Street Station. The abandoned station loomed like a tomb. Art Deco architecture gone to rust and graffiti, windows boarded, entrance chained. But as we approached, I saw the gap in the fence. The stairs descending into darkness, the old iron gate that barred the way down. The carriage skidded to a halt. We tumbled out into gray dawn light, Severin's forces half a block behind and closing fast. Morel and her guards formed a defensive line while Lucian staggered toward the gate, his bandaged hands fumbling with the ancient lock. "It requires blood," he said. "Royal blood willingly given." "Then give it," I urged. He unwrapped one hand, the burns raw and weeping, and pressed his palm to the gate's center. For a moment, nothing. Then the metal sang, a low, resonant note that vibrated through my bones, and the lock clicked open. The gate swung wide, revealing stairs that descended into absolute darkness, and from the depths rose a smell like old incense and older stone. "Inside," Morel commanded. "Now." We plunged into the undercity as Severin's soldiers reached the fence, and behind us, the gate slammed shut with finality. Somewhere in the darkness above, Severin's voice echoed, "Run, little king." But you can't hide from what's coming. The truth was, I didn't think he was wrong, but we descended anyway, into the dark where the oldest laws still held, and I held Clara's hand tight enough to hurt. The chapel was waiting. The chapel breathed like something living. We descended through layers of the city's forgotten architecture, past bricked-over subway platforms, through maintenance tunnels marked with warnings in languages that predated English. Downstairs so old the stone had worn smooth as glass. Clara's flashlight beam carved wild shadows on walls carved with symbols I couldn't read but somehow felt. Wards, promises, threats. Then the passage opened, and we entered the sanctuary, candles. Hundreds of them, lit by unseen hands or perhaps by nothing human at all, their flames steady despite the draft. They illuminated a space that shouldn't exist beneath a modern city, a chapel carved from bedrock, Gothic arches soaring into shadow, and everywhere the statuary of broken saints. Their faces had been chiseled away, leaving smooth stone where eyes and mouths should be, but their hands remained, some raised in blessing, others clutching swords, all of them watching without sight. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat a throne of black oak. It looked ancient enough to predate the city above, massive and stark, carved with thorny vines that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. And resting on its seat, untouched by dust or time, lay a crown. Not gold, not silver, something darker, iron maybe, or tarnished bronze, worked into the shape of thorns so intricate they looked ready to draw blood just from looking. "The crimson throne," Morel whispered, something like reverence in her voice. "It's been empty for 3 years, since Lucian went into exile among humans. To sit it again, he must be acclaimed by the court or prove his right through ordeal. We don't have time for—" I started. The gate behind us exploded inward. Severin came through the splintered iron with zealots at his back. Not the polished nobles from my street, but something older, wilder. Their eyes burned with hunger barely leashed, their movements predatory and wrong. Behind them, human soldiers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, night vision goggles glinting. "Sanctuary doesn't apply to treason," Severin announced, his voice echoing off stone. "And calling an unlawful conclave in a forbidden chapel is exactly that." Morel's captain, Lucia, tall and scarred and holding a blade that looked forged from moonlight, stepped forward to intercept Severin's lieutenant. Steel rang against steel, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Around them, the chapel erupted into violence, noble against noble, old law against coup. I pulled Clara behind a pillar, my useless kitchen knife raised, and watched immortals fight with a grace that made my bones ache. They moved like water, like wind, like nightmares given form, and the human soldiers couldn't keep up, their bullets going wide, their tactical training useless against speed that shouldn't exist. Lucian walked through the chaos as if alone, his burned hands clenched at his sides, making his way toward the throne. But I saw what he didn't. Clara's small hand gripping my arm, her other hand pointing upward. "Mom," she hissed. "The grate. There's a mirror." I followed her gaze to the crypt grate 20 feet up, where ventilation ducts met the chapel ceiling. In the shadows, barely visible, a circular mirror reflected candlelight, and the unmistakable glint of a sniper's scope, aimed at Lucienne. "Clara, stay here," but she was already moving, small and quick, darting through the fighting to a lever set into the wall, old mechanical system for sealing the crypt. She grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The grate slammed shut with a boom that shook dust from the ceiling. Above, someone screamed as the mechanism caught them, and the rifle clattered down to shatter on stone. Severin's head snapped around, fury twisting his perfect features. "Enough," he snarled, and suddenly he was in front of Lucian, blade to his throat. "You want the throne? You'll have to kill me for it, and we both know you won't. Not anymore. You've gone soft, Lucian, weak with mortal sympathies. The chapel fell silent, battle pausing mid-strike as everyone turned to watch. Lucian stood perfectly still, Severin's blade drawing a thin line of blood below his jaw. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner. "I invoke the ordeal of mercy," gasps. Even Severin's expression flickered with surprise. "Ancient right," Lucian continued. "Trial by combat, but victory without slaughter. Win and prove myself worthy of the crown. Lose and yield it to you. But if I win without killing, if I prove mercy is strength, then the throne is lawfully mine, and all here must acknowledge it." "You're half dead already," Severin said. "You can barely stand. Then it should be easy for you." Lucien stepped back, forcing Severin to lower the blade or cut him down where he stood. "Or are you afraid of a fair fight?" Severin's smile was all teeth. "Very well. Your funeral. They fought in the space before the throne, and it was nothing like the chaos that had raged moments before. This was surgical, deliberate. Severin attacking with centuries of skill, Lucian defending with something harder to name. He didn't try to kill, only to disarm, to exhaust, to outlast. His burned hands must have screamed with every parry, but he moved with a precision that spoke of control so absolute, it looked like mercy, and he was winning. Severin's strikes grew wild, frustrated. Lucien disarmed him once, let him retrieve his blade. Disarmed him again, stepped back instead of pressing advantage. It was humiliating, this public demonstration of restraint, and Severin's soldiers began to shift uneasily. "Kill me," Severin spat, breathing hard. "Prove you're still capable." "No," Lucian said simply. The final exchange lasted 3 heartbeats. Severin lunged, overcommitted, and Lucian caught his wrist, twisted, and sent the blade spinning away. Then he stepped past, seized the throne's armrest, and lowered himself into the ancient seat. The crown lifted from the cushion, by itself, by some old magic, and settled onto his white hair. The thorns drew blood immediately, thin crimson lines running down his temples, but Lucian didn't flinch. He sat like every king who'd ever ruled from that chair, wounded and weary and utterly unyielding. "I am returned," he said, his voice resonating with power that made the candles gutter. "And I charge Severin with collusion against the court, with alliance to human corporations that profit from our hunger, with sabotage and attempted regicide." "Lies," Severin snarled, but his own soldiers were backing away, uncertainty clear on their faces. Morel stepped forward, producing a slim folder I hadn't seen her carrying. Bank transfers, emails between Severin's ministers and pharmaceutical executives, flight logs showing his people meeting with military contractors. She let the papers fall at his feet. "The evidence was easy to find once we knew where to look. You didn't even hide it well. Around the chapel, soldiers knelt, some reluctantly, others with visible relief. The coup was breaking, its foundations exposed as corruption rather than conviction." Lucian rose from the throne, blood from the crown still wet on his face, and approached me. Clara clung to my leg, but I didn't step back. "Evelyn Hart," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "You pulled me from drowning when you owed me nothing. You sheltered me when surrender would have been safer. You proved that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of courage." He reached up, removed a thorn from the crown, the gesture clearly painful, and held it out. "I name you protector by grace of the hearth. Your home, wherever you make it, is inviolate court ground. No vampire may enter uninvited. No court may threaten you or yours. And if any try..." The thorn in his hand caught candlelight, wicked and sharp. "They answer to me." I took the thorn, felt its weight, literal and symbolic, and nodded. Lucien turned to Severin, still kneeling in defeat. "Exile, monastic hunger, bagged blood only, no live feeding for 1 century. If you survive that long with your convictions intact, petition for return. But if I hear of you organizing against the treaties..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Severin was dragged away by Morel's guards, his perfect composure finally shattered. The chapel exhaled, tension bleeding away into exhausted relief, and in the candlelight, surrounded by broken saints and ancient stone, I held my daughter close and watched a vampire king reclaim his throne with blood and mercy intertwined. Dawn was coming. But for now, the night had chosen its sovereign, and somehow, impossibly, that sovereign had chosen us. Dawn painted the alleys pink and gold as Morel's caravan brought us home. The street looked like a crime scene without the tape. Hoofprints burned into asphalt. Deep wheel ruts in Mrs. Chen's lawn. Scorch marks on the pavement where green lanterns had gutted out. But the carriages were gone. The soldiers vanished. And when I checked my phone, miraculously recharged, the news called it a minor electrical outage on Blackthorn Row because it was under investigation. The world had already begun forgetting what it had witnessed. My house stood waiting, and despite the broken back door and shattered windows, it looked different. Taller, somehow, proud, as if surviving a siege had given it spine it hadn't known it possessed. Inside, the wreckage was extensive but not total. Overturned furniture, salt ground into carpets, blood on the basement stairs that might never come out. But someone had been here during the coronation. A new lock gleamed on the front door, solid, expensive, the kind that belonged on embassies. The broken windows had been temporarily boarded with wood that smelled freshly cut. And in the kitchen, tucked beneath the stale rolls in the bread box, I found a ring, red enamel, a crown of thorns worked in gold, and beside it, a note in handwriting that looked calligraphed by candlelight. You pulled me from drowning. I will pull your life from obscurity. Eli slipped the ring into my pocket and didn't tell Clara. Not yet. 3 nights later, a carriage arrived, but not black, white as new bone, pulled by a single gray horse, no guards, no ceremony. Lucian stepped out wearing modern clothes that almost fit, his burned hands wrapped in clean bandages, the thorny crown nowhere in sight. He knocked. I opened the door, and he stood on my porch like any man who needed an invitation, his crimson eyes uncertain. I don't suppose, he said carefully, you have coffee? I stepped aside. Come in. He crossed the threshold, freely this time, by choice, and something settled in the house, some tension I hadn't known I was carrying. Clara appeared from the living room, took one look at him, and demanded he tell her about constellations with names nobody remembered. So he did. Sitting on my repaired sofa with instant coffee going cold in his hands, he told stories about stars that had died before humans learned to write, about navigation by darkness, about the way the sky looked before cities drowned it in light. Clara listened, rapt, and I listened too, not just to the stories, but to the gentle rhythm of his voice, the way he shaped wonder from memory. Later, after Clara finally fell asleep upstairs, Lucian and I sat across from each other at my kitchen table, the same table where this had all started, where I'd made the choice to shelter a stranger. The treaties, he said quietly. I'm rewriting them. Not just peace, but partnership. Humans and the court, transparent and accountable. It'll take decades, maybe centuries, and it'll require mortals willing to negotiate with monsters. Good thing you know one, I said. His smile was small, real. Yes, I do. Outside, Blackthorn Row slept its ordinary sleep, oblivious, safe, continuing. And inside my house that had survived a siege and earned a crown's protection, I thought about the ocean and secrets, and the stranger I'd refused to let drown. I dragged him from a sinking jet to save a stranger. By the next night, when 5 black carriages filled our street, I understood. I had pulled the night itself into our house, and somehow the night had decided we were its home.